it took me a long time to understand what sacrifice meant. Because on the surface of it, especially the way it's acted out, like burnt offerings and that sort of thing, it just seems like, well, it seems so archaic and distant from us that it's not really comprehensible. But partly from reading Jean Piaget, and Nietzsche for that matter, I started to understand that people often acted out conceptions before they understood what they meant. And we act out a lot of things we don't understand because we're much more complex than we can represent. So we're always acting out things we don't understand. But so there's this idea in Cain and Abel that you have to make sacrifices in order to stay on the good side of God. And so I thought about that practically, say, not so much metaphysically, but practically, and realized that that was equivalent to the discovery of time, of the future. Because we do act, and this is a peculiar discovery of human beings, and maybe a consequence of our expanded intelligence, is that we're actually aware of the future. We actually treat the future as if it's something that you can bargain with. Now, partly it's because the future is other people, and they remember your reputation, they remember your past actions, and if you do someone a favor, then that favor is in some sense stored up in the future. So you could think about the future as a place of judgment about your moral actions, and it's not that far from that to imagining a God who's keeping track of that, or who even is that. But in any case, the idea of sacrifice emerges in the story of Cain and Abel, and Cain and Abel both make sacrifices to God in order to stay on his good side, let's say. And what a sacrifice means is that you give up something of value in the present so that you can improve the future. And that's no different from what we call discipline. It's exactly the same thing. It's just the concretely acted out version of that. And so, the idea basically was that, well, God was in the transcendent heavens. And the first question would be, well, why is that? And it's like, well, if you go out on a really dark night and look up at the sky, you have a sense of what's beyond you, what's transcendent, what's infinite. And so to associate that with the highest of values is a reasonable association, right, from an emotional point of view. So it's not particularly primitive. It's a smart metaphor, or it's a smart intuition. And it's above you. And we tend to think of when you're moving towards an ideal that you're moving up, that you're moving above, you're moving to the mountaintop, right? You're going up, not down. And so it all sits within that same framework. And it's partly because when you go up, like on a mountain, you can see for long distances, right? So all those things are tangled together. So anyways, so the idea is that you have to give up something of value now so that you make the future better. And sometimes it's even something you love now, and that's a good example too, because often the things that stop us from moving forward are our attachments to things that we should no longer be attached to, right? And in fact, you can almost make that definitional. If you're not moving forward in your life, there's a high probability that you have some idea or some mode of action or some habit that you're so in love with that you won't let go of it, until you can understand that even someone who doesn't believe, it doesn't matter, it's the psychological state of mind that matters, is they're out for revenge on being itself. And that's why they produce as much mayhem as possible in the shortest period of time. That's why they sacrifice innocent people, because it's much more vengeful and demonstrative to kill innocent people than to kill guilty people, right? Because it's a worse sin, so to speak. And then they kill themselves. And they kill themselves as a final demonstration of their belief in nihilism and the horror of existence. Because you might say, well, why don't they just kill themselves first and save everyone the trouble? And there's narcissism in that too, because they know their names are going to be splashed across the page. That's their notoriety instead of their accomplishment. And of course, the media is unbelievably complicit in that. So when you're talking about motivation for evil, then you have to understand what it is that's driving it, and it is a deep resentment about the structure of being, for being saturated with suffering, but also for rejecting your sacrifices, and that that produces the bitterness of failure. And I'll stop with this. One of the things that's really interesting about the Old Testament is that, and the Jews in the Old Testament, is that they don't take the path of Cain. Every time they're walloped by God, which is like fairly frequently, they say, we must have done something wrong and we have to set ourselves right. And that's an unbelievably heroic attitude, because that's the alternative to cursing fate. It's like you take the responsibility for failure onto yourself.
The idea that there's any such thing as an objective failure is highly questionable. I don't resonate. Any concept of an objective failure other than the failure to participate in your nature, your epigenetic directives, that is driving hunger. The reason for this is ascertained by examining internal struggle or tension between giving in to that which is essentially natural hunger, epigenetic objectives. That there's a tension within oneself to comprehend fulfillment of these desires. I think Alan Watts reconciles it with the best possible viewpoint when he says, I am these hungers, hooray, this is great. There's nothing pushing me around against what I want, I am this wanting that I contain. But people struggle to reconcile this in that way. They, for some reason, feel that they're in a quest of sorts, a dichotomy of struggle between desires that don't come across in their own ego sense as desirable, as acceptable desires. And I think that's where you start thinking about good and evil and the sacrifice within that construct of what good or evil could be. But in Zen, you easily transcend that dichotomy with a very, very easy question, which essentially allows you to describe human contact as it allows you to point out human contact on the good side as definitively and objectively good, and essentially be an Occam's razor mechanism to point out the goodness of any and all human contact which you can engage, which you can reach for and experience. So if you get the question phrased in that way, in that accurate equation that is depicting human contact, and then you start solving the equation by eliminating, and this is your radical creativity method here, to cancel out anything in the equation that doesn't actually correspond to the essence of the human contact that is ultimately beneficial or ultimately contains actual value, the actual sensation of what you're doing, what you want to do, what you are.
Out there in no man's land, out there in potential, there's threat and like mortal threat. but there's also endless opportunity and riches and wealth and the possibility of attracting someone and all of that. And so, well, the dragon, you can't just be afraid of it. You just stay in your burrow the whole time. And lots of animals more or less do that, you know, especially the nocturnal ones. They just hide away. But that isn't what human beings are like, because we're not only prey animals, right? We're also predators. And then, of course, we're crazy. We're absolutely insane chimpanzees, right? We're crazy. And so we're always out there mucking about with things and with our, you know, fingers and our thumbs and taking the world apart and putting it back together. And we're crazily exploratory and troublemaking. And so we don't just run from dragons, we go hunt them down. And so there's a story here. There's the oldest story that mankind knows, and literally it is the oldest story that we know, is this story. It's in the story basically is there's a bounded space, a walled garden, a walled city, you know, and all the original cities were walled, because if they weren't, barbarians would swoop in and they'd just steal all your stuff. And so, you know, that was kind of pointless. So, you know, you wanted to have some major league walls surrounding your territory. And so that's inhabited space, and inside that is your little dominance hierarchy. And so all you primates knew exactly who was who inside that space, so you didn't have to fight with each other, and you could predict each other's behavior because you believed the same things and saw the world roughly the same way and acted the same way, and so you were sort of secure. But then the problem is that that can always be breached. There's always something outside of it that's a danger, and so that's signified by this little creature here, this dragon. And that twirl in its tail is very common among dragons. It's actually a symbol, because imagistic languages, imagistic symbols have an ancient language, and it's referring to something that's basically eternal. And see, it lives down here in this cave, because it's an underground thing. It's an underground thing, and you can kind of imagine what that's like. And sometimes this happens in initiation rituals among archaic people. When they're gonna initiate, usually the young men, because nature initiates women all by itself. Usually the young men, maybe they'll put them in a cave and leave them there, you know, for like, well, who knows how long. And so you got to think, what's in a cave? And caves are dark, man. I don't know if you've ever been in one, but like they're dark, and they're really dark. And so not only is there whatever there is in the cave, and you don't know what the hell's in the cave, there's whatever you imagine might be in the cave. And so when you're in that cave and you're alone, you're confronting the devils and demons and monsters of your own imagination, you know. And so then you have a chance to perhaps deal with that and overcome it, and that's perhaps part of the initiation ceremony, you know, and that's part of growing up, because you have to learn how to face the things that terrify and upset you and recast them and put them back together. We talked a little bit about this idea of the pre-cosmogonic chaos that Iliad refers to, and that's the stuff out of which order is produced at the beginning of time, and it's also the stuff out of which you constantly reproduce order. And the Jungians, the psychoanalysts, especially the really deep psychoanalysts like Jung, Freud was a more surface psychoanalyst, and that's not an insult. There's some things that Freud figured out that are absolutely amazing. He was a precursor to Jung for sure. For Jung, the hero's journey was the journey inside the unconscious, and that would be perhaps in some sense the willingness to face everything terrible that's happened to you and to think it through and to articulate it and to come to grips perhaps with your own capacity for malevolence. That was a really important part of Jungian ideas, that the first step towards individuation, which is the manifestation of your full self, let's say, was the discovery of your shadow. And your shadow is the part of you that will do terrible things under the right circumstances, and maybe even without that much provocation. And you know, and it's a terrifying part of you to come into contact with, because it's sort of the way that you're specifically attached to the archetype of evil. That's a good way of thinking about it. And you know, modern people, they don't really think much about the idea of good and evil, but that's because most of them are so damn naive, you can just barely even comprehend it. You know, if you read any history, if you really read it, like, and you don't come away with the idea that evil exists, it's like you're just reading the wrong kind of history, you know. It's just unbelievable what people can do to each other. And we're so imaginative, you know. And one of the things I figured out about people, the reason that we have the knowledge of good and evil, let's say, is that because we're self-conscious and we know about ourselves, we know about our own vulnerability, right? You know what hurts you. You really know what hurts you, way more than an animal knows. And so, and you're also creative, and so once you know what hurts you, man, you can really hurt someone else. And you can do it in such a creative way. You can draw it out, you can make it excruciating, you can take people apart physically and psychologically. And you can keep them, say, even right on the edge of death, so that you can keep doing that endlessly. And, you know, that happens. A hell of a lot more than you think it happens. It happens a lot. And so, well, and you think, well, you know, that doesn't involve me. It's like, oh yes it does, man. That's the problem, because, you know, you're human, and that's the sort of things that human beings are capable of. And I'm not saying it's all probable that you do that ever, or that, but I'm saying that, you know, you got to take that into account. When you're looking at the world and you think about all the perpetrators out there, it's like, it's not like there's perpetrators and there's victims. That isn't how it works. It doesn't work that way at all. And so the horrors of humanity, as well as the noble elements of humanity, are all elements of your central being. And for Jung, and this is the terrible thing, for Jung, the pathway to higher wisdom was through the terrible portal of, well, you could say hell, for that matter. Really. And so who wants to do that, man? It's like, no. You know, like maybe you're resentful about something. Well, you probably are, because like everybody's resentful about something, you know? And resentment is just a vicious emotion. It's really useful. It's really useful, because if you're resentful about something, it either means that you should grow the hell up and accept the responsibility and quit sniveling around and whining, or it means that someone actually is oppressing you and pushing on you too hard and bullying you and demeaning you, and you have something to say or do that you're not saying or doing. And no wonder you're not saying or doing it, because, you know, it can be really dangerous to say things or do them to free yourself from being oppressed. You can get in a lot of trouble in the short term for doing it, so it's easier just to not say anything, sort of day after day. In the short term you protect yourself, but it just crushes you. And then the resentment comes up, and resentment, and that can just get so out of hand, you know. It starts with resentment, and then it goes to the desire for revenge, you know, because you'll play nasty little tricks on the person that's oppressing you. At any chance, you'll talk about them behind their back, and if they want you to do something, you'll do it badly, or you'll do it grudgingly, or you'll do a half-rate job, and you'll set up little traps, and, you know, so it puts you in a poisonous space. And then if you really start to dwell on that, say, in your basement for 3 or 4 years about just exactly how terrible the world is, and how that's focused on you, and how everyone's rejected you, and how you get to this point where you're thinking that, you know, existence itself is a kind of poisonous endeavor, and that the best thing for you to do is go out there and do as much, you know, create as much mayhem as you possibly can. And if you really get to a dark place, you think, I'm going to create as much mayhem as I possibly can by targeting the most innocent thing I can possibly imagine. And so that's a bad road, man. There's dark things down there, but you can go there, and people do, and they go through the hole of resentment. And so resentment can tell you you've got something to say. You bloody well better say it. You gotta free yourself from what's oppressing you. You have to stand up for that, because otherwise you become oppressed, and then once you're oppressed, that's just not so good. And
you're
so,
doing it to
like
yourself
in your marriage and your relationships, you got to tell people what you're thinking. You don't have to assume you're right. That's a whole different story, because you're not, because you're, you know, ignorant, and you're biased, and, you know, so you're not right, but you can stumble towards the expression of yourself, and then you can listen to the other person and hope that they tell you some way that you're stupid that's useful, so you can be a little less stupid in the future, because wouldn't that be good? And so, you know, you go after the unknown. You don't protect what you know. You already know what you know. You go after what you don't know. That's why you have to talk to people you don't agree with. That's why you have to talk to your enemies, because they're going to tell you things you don't know. You could even listen to them. It's possible they know a thing or two you don't know. But people don't like that, you know. They just talk to people who think the same way, and then they just stay stupid.
Dead
so
end.
that's not good, because if you're not wise, the world will wallop you. It'll flatten you, and far more than it has to. And then you'll be bitter and resentful, and you'll be part of that force that wallops instead of the force that fights against that. So Well, so you go after the dragon, and that's what this guy is doing. He's going after the dragon. It's threatening the society, because it always does. Chaos, what's outside of order, always threatens order. Always. Always. And so you have to step forward, in this manner, voluntarily, and go after that when it's still manageable, right? And that's the case in your own life too. So if you've had a proclivity to be bullied in the past, and you want to get out of that, what you have to do is you have to make yourself awake to the what would you say, to the initial stages of that sort of bullying emerging in your life again, that sort of domination, and you have to step forward against it when it's still in its developing stages, because maybe you can just not have it happen. That would be better. And so you have to be ready to speak what you have to say more or less on a moment's notice. You can't be impulsive about it. Like if you and I are talking and you make a mistake or I make a mistake, even if it bothers one or the other of us, we should just write it off, because it's like one encounter. What the hell? Maybe we had a bad night's sleep or something, So you got to be a little forgiving. But if it happens twice, then, you should be a little awake. And you should remember both times. And then if it happens a third time, it's like that's when you act. And you say, look, we talked and this happened, and I thought, yeah, whatever. But then you did it again. And then you just did it again. Well, then the person is basically like, what are they going to do? No, well, maybe they might argue with you, but you kind of got them. And generally, if you just point that out to people, just like that, just that you noticed and are willing to say something about it, they'll back the hell off. They'll often apologize. And sometimes you even make them a little more conscious, which is like, hey, that's not such a bad idea. And that's what all this means. And so this chaos idea, so for Jung, it was the unconscious, right? It was the contents of your unconscious. And so that might be the unknown past, the threatening past that you have never dealt with. Might be the threatening future. It might be the threatening present. But Jung realized as he got older that the unconscious was also the world. And you think, and so the chaos is not only your unconscious mind, which meets the unknown, but it's actually the unknown itself mingled together. And you think, what the hell does that? That's why the dragon is a land creature and an air creature. It's matter and spirit at the same time. And this sort of gets us into constructivism. Because the constructivists think that basically what happens is that you encounter those elements of the world that don't fit into your theory, and out of those new elements you make the world through your perceptions, and you make yourself by incorporating the information and transforming yourself. And that's how Piaget explains the development of a child. The child starts out with some reflexes, basic reflexes, and manifesting the reflexes produces results in the world, and then the child has to reorganize its perceptions to take into account the transformations, and so then it gets a little more sophisticated, and then it can do a few more things, and then it can manifest more changes in the world, and then it tracks them and modifies its perceptions and actions to account for them, and it just keeps doing that, and that's how the child boots itself up, like a computer does.
Programming. That's age 1 to 7. You just watch. You don't have to do anything. You program automatically. Now, what's difficult is when your program involves trauma and neglect. Then you have a serious task of reprogramming to approach. Which I find resonant when Alan Watts says that this is one of the first things that resonated out of his lecture, included in the first Ultra Plateau I've just been editing and contemplating lately. Since it was about 2 months ago, just under 60 days ago, that I put this together as a compilation of the earliest major Watts excerpts that I had encountered. He says that to figure out how to cure the bad effects of what we think of as education is absolutely necessary. That if we don't figure that out, then we are not succeeding as a metaconscious group of human beings. And my grasp on exactly what he's saying about metaconsciousness would come gradually, come along as I listened to the talks specifically focused on that. Those are the talks that he really explores the educational value of the sensations about death and about fear and about bravery itself, which is, I think, Jordan Peterson spends more time in that headspace exploring. It's more of his main area of interest, whereas I think Watts ended up integrating that into a majority of later talks on organism intelligence. But I didn't have a grasp on it when I first was listening to Watts, and I heard him say that curing the bad effects of education was the challenge, the essential flaw in our current social contract. And I still believe that that's the flaw. If there is one singular flaw, one way of defining the error in the current social contract, it's that. It's that education proceeds along in a way that's completely disingenuous to creativity or metaconsciousness or organism intelligence, and then we're all completely mixed up by the time we actually, if we even manage to even get through that in one piece, as it were. You're in a holding pattern, basically. You may go your whole life and never encounter yourself up until that point where you're actually faced with, as he describes in The Inevitable Ecstasy in quite great detail, you're faced with that demise looking you in the face situation. If you actually manage to encounter that and still live to tell the tale, then you've kind of discovered your cure. But what he's saying is that we need to contemplate death and demise, and we need to befriend it. We need to utilize it for reaching the real education plateau that is about organism intelligence. I find that that's the primary singular thread inside of the adventurer philosophy or creative consciousness by way of adventuring and crafting model that I've been thinking about and trying to, in essence, create the tutorial about how to use it, how to think about it, how to engage it, and what are the exact means of playing this game of an adventurer. I was having this thought while listening in on the mega rerun I ran over the last 2 days. It ran just under 2 full run-throughs. I went ahead and stopped it with the last 4 lecture chunks left off on the second time just now, because it would have still been going right now if I had given it a stop point. But what I was thinking about it is... God damn it, that guy despawned while I was trying to get to him for the objective. I was thinking about how I had to gradually realize that the koan essence of Watts' style, his narrative mythos, because they didn't have any such a thing beyond television and film, or, play on the stage. That's it. That's the only kind of gameplay that they had, besides card games and billiards. At the time that he came up with all of this wordcraft. But what he was doing with the wordcraft was literally conveying huge contexts and viewpoints within those contexts to transport the listener to these places, into the gameplay. He was literally crafting gameplay and leaving it there for us to go find and for us to go explore and to absorb the meaning of it from every which perspective that he would happen to spell out across the course of his work. So the realization of that was this process for me of absorbing, of it dawning on me how I found the questions that I'm using and that I have used to um, to develop the entire every single fragment and particle of what my craft now contains and necessarily involves, from everything from compilation to just writing to narration to how that all is going to fit into gameplay and game design and world building and player experiences. Um, when I get up to the very top of how that's going to work um, as an actual game, a playable game, I need to say, because it is going to be a game before it's playable. You'll still be able to experience the game via my narration and my content, my segments about it, essentially. But I went through the experience of going to the places that Watts was describing and establishing and transporting me to, and then realizing the questions that were involved in that, and the questions that I had always been asking but didn't note as such. I was asking them without understanding that that's what I was doing. So once I became aware of the questions themselves, that was the point where I started to unravel the whole thing, the whole idea of mythos, craft, and gameplay, and the way these two ideas interact together. When you get into the idea about what is crafting, what does it mean, and what is education, what does knowledge mean, what is XP, what's it for, and what does it do, and how do we access it, and how do we harness it. But the earliest thread of that was a feeling like Alan Watts is a character in my game, that he's speaking directly to me as in the Stanley narrator. And I feel like the Stanley Parable created that context, that ability for me to feel spoken to as an entity in gameplay. But it almost seems like Watts founded the idea, and that vibration came to Davey Reedon when he scribbled all the instructions on the notepad and started building such a game experience. The two seem to mutually arise in my mind of what my game is. The entire Stanley Parable metaphysics and the entire Alan Watts adventure stack, the whole entire thing. These two just arise completely mutually as gameplay in my experience so far. Because what it's about is facing your challenges and locating your skills and understanding what is the physical thing inside your HP and mana bubbles. What is that? What is reality that these items in your inventory and in your UI reflect and resonate through? The gameplay conveys that. The gameplay allows you to perceive, to have the perception, to have the knowledge of what this physical vibration that's happening is, and to interact with it. That's the most important thing, that there is an interaction present, where you are canvassing the game world that you are, the game that you're in. You're playing your game in order to do this. I spoke about this in all the narrations that I featured in this rerun, and when taken all together, along with the specific Watts passages that make up the whole curriculum stack 2, which has a little bit of overlap with the first curriculum, but it's generally full lectures that weren't even excerpted in the first stack. And the way it differs is exactly in this, in the way that the topic is specifically consciousness and sleep and the action of death and the significance of creating and building technology and communicating with ourselves and each other as a social organism. It's that arrival point that kind of feels like a 0 and a 1, two interacting values that go together, so the two curriculums kind of cross back and forth toward each other and away from each other, and they're just bouncing. And each one expresses something similar, but they're kind of the inverted image of each other in what particular concept you're actually thinking about, whether you're thinking about singularity, the individual, or the totality, the expanse of organism, of the whole, of all experience.